Hello, 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 and welcome to What the Trans.
What the Trans?
Yes, said like a true Dalek there, Michelle. Yes, it's What the Trans. A bi-weekly news podcast for the trans in your life. And if that's you, hi, how you doing? And if that's not you, I guess welcome to the show.
Yeah, what are you doing here? We make no allowances for the cis people. I mean, you're welcome to stay, but when cis people have told me that they listen to the show, it's usually always followed by, what does this word mean? What does this mean? What does that mean? You're too into it. Widen your scope.
Yes, we know your sort. We've got your number, etc. No, I think we're being very silly. We're quite happy for anybody to listen to this podcast. So how are you, Michelle?
Oh, I've been very busy dealing with family in the good way. My family from the US came over. Hello, Owen and Keith, if you happen to be listening. And hello to Tony, who is much less likely to be listening because I'm not entirely sure he knows what a podcast is. But they were in the UK. I took them around all those places up north. We had pie-based things.
Of course.
Took them around London a bit. Had more street foodie-based things. Although I did find out, like, I used to, as you know, I grew up in the north of England, and it's very hard for me to say where my hometown is because there was like 5 or 6 that I would go between. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so you were kind of in the middle. Yeah, I get you.
So I was in one of these towns with my family, and we were looking at artisanal pork pies and Greek street food and the like, and I just could not stop thinking, the last time I was here, I threw up on that town cross in the centre.
Classy.
That was me like 20 years ago or something when I was there, and now they've got all sorts of Lebanese street food and everything there. It's all in Yorkshire now. It's all in Yorkshire.
I mean, Yorkshire have been rolling with the artisan pie thing for a little while, and more power to them, frankly, because I lived in Ingleton for a little while, and there were a couple of, like actual proper butchers that did really good pies. So, yes, I was there quite a lot. So good they made my voice turn slightly demonic when I described just how good they were. So,
well, it's just such a different thing from when I was growing up there. Like, completely different. Yeah. Like, the town we were in used to be where friends of mine would go to pick up drugs, and now it's where people go to pick up, like, goat's milk, infused olive oil. It is so strange what has happened to my ends. But how have you been, Ashleigh?
You can't go home again, can you? Yes, I've been fine. It's probably worth mentioning. There's been so much work recently. So regular listeners may be aware that I have very non-specifically made mention to the fact that I work for a La-di-da Arts Festival and that it's internationally based and that it's in Manchester. And you can probably put that together if you particularly want to.
So it is an international festival in Manchester.
It is. It is a Manchester International Festival.
So why don't they call it the Northern England Festival for Arts and Stuff?
I've no idea. Just write to the board, see if they'll take that suggestion up. But basically, that means that big thing, which you may even have seen on posters and stuff, that's where I work. That's my job. I don't do anything particularly interesting within that job in terms of producing exciting artworks and things. I literally order the coffee and make sure all the paper clips are in a straight line and all that kind of thing. But that is all about to go off. Because it is like a 2 week, well, slightly more than 2 weeks at the very start of July, and it's starting off with like Yoko Ono's doing a thing in one of the public spaces in Manchester, and Janelle Monáe will be playing in Castlefield Bowl, and those two things are happening on the same night. There's all sorts of other stuff. So Idris Elba has been involved with producing a play that's going to be on. There's a thing by Philip Glass. There's a huge exhibition of David Lynch's artwork, the film director's, and he's doing some talks, which I think he's dialing in. I don't believe he's actually coming to Manchester, but this is the biggest exhibition of David Lynch's artwork that there has been, full stop, where it's all been collected together in one place. Unless, I'm guessing they're excluding David Lynch's presumably capacious garage from this, because that's probably got a lot of stuff in it, right? That would be of note to curators. Anyway, so it's all big and terribly exciting, and there's lots of stuff happening, but that also means that there's a lot of stuff to organize. And working with a lot of arty people who've got a lot of stuff to organize, it's just an exercise, an extended exercise in conflict de-escalation. It's like, okay, you need to I understand that this is important to you. It's like, oh, but it's important. It's absolutely urgent. Yeah, but is it though? Because there's a whole thing, like, which I saw best summed up on, like, Picard management tips on Twitter, which was that if you spend your entire life at Red Alert becomes meaningless. And so if everybody's running around describing everything as urgent the whole time, it can be a bit, it's like, okay, all right, just take a deep breath. Let's make you some tea. What's the problem? Let's see if we can facilitate some assistance, or let's see if we can help you out, kind of thing. So
you're trying to like decode whether, is this urgent, an actual urgent, or is this urgent like it can wait, but this person thinks it's urgent?
I mean, I couldn't possibly comment as to the operational structure for that kind of decision. I'm sorry. Yeah, but so obviously it's the same in any workplace, though. This is not stuff that's going to be a mystery to anybody. There's always crunch times and periods where things are a bit more busy and a bit more difficult. And this is ours because we're about to launch and do the festival. Working in retail, it's over Christmas. Working in finance, it's the end of the tax year. In the arts, it's whenever your festival's happening. So, yes, it's a fascinating set of experiences, obviously, meeting all sorts of very, very interesting people.
But you're not going to get much sleep.
I'm going to get almost no sleep. And I don't think I'm going to be wearing that as a badge of honor. I'll just be like, no, I'm 34, I need to sleep. So, yes. So that's been my time since we last conversed. That's what I have been doing. I have been trying to fit a harness to a thunderstorm or something equally verbose. I am very tired.
It's okay. I am also a little tired, but my issue is, I would argue, just as manic as yours is, as I took a nap earlier today that was for 2 hours instead of 90 minutes, so I woke up right in the middle of my REM sleep cycle, and that has been bothering me ever since. So some might say I am more harried than you are right now, Ashleigh. Some might say I'm having it tougher.
Fuck off.
Should we get on with some terrible news?
Yeah, some would say that, but those people are dicks. And yes, we should. Let's get on with the podcast. So yeah, terrible news, as you say. Although it's not all doom and gloom this week, and there is a very good reason for that. The sort of main section of the show later on is hopefully going to be quite positive, quite nice. But first, we do have to do the news, which sucks because the news sucks. It's kind of how it works. What do we have first, darling?
Going on to the terrible news in Scotland.
Do you want me to do a bagpipe noise? Because I don't want to do a bagpipe noise.
It's probably best you don't. But mostly because, I don't know what the rules are for the English to impersonate a bagpipe. It might be, it might get into culturally insensitive territory.
Definitely rules about that. And if there aren't, perhaps there should be. Anyway, to Scotland.
To Scotland, where the Scottish Government are putting the terrible into terrible news by announcing that plans to reform the Gender Recognition Act will be delayed subject to a second public consultation after a backlash by TERF groups was far more effective than it ever should have been. The government was well on the way to reforming the GRA in Scotland, so applicants would no longer be subject to a panel, would no longer be subject to providing medical evidence to justify their change of legal gender, and could potentially have led the way to legal non-binary recognition. The Scottish Government has already held one 16-week public consultation that showed that 60% of respondents supported proposals to introduce self-ID, 61% of respondents supported the idea of 16 to 17-year-olds being able to get their gender identity legally recognised. 59% of respondents said that they were open to kids who are under 16 attaining legal recognition. And 62% of respondents said the Scottish Government should take action to recognise non-binary people. But in spite of all this, Shirley Ann Somerville, the Secretary for Social Security and Older People, announced on June 20th that plans to reform the GRA will be pushed back in a blog post on the Scottish Government's website. She justified the delay by saying, "I'm acutely aware of how divided opinion is on this issue, and I want to proceed in a way that builds maximum consensus and allows valid concerns to be properly addressed." Build maximum consensus after a whole bunch of 60% across the board saying they're all cool with it. That makes fucking sense. She also said that the government will withdraw its current trans guidance for schools, saying the Scottish Government recognises that in taking the inarguably good general principle of inclusivity and developing specific recommendations, the approach risks potentially excluding other girls from female-only spaces. We have therefore decided to replace the LGBT youth work with guidance from the Scottish Government. This work is underway and will be available by the end of the year and be subject to an equality impact assessment. A new gender recognition bill for Scotland will be published by the end of the year, and the draft will be subject to an equality impact assessment, as well as another full public consultation, like the first one wasn't already a fucking nightmare. The new proposals will now no longer include what anyone would be able to call self-identification. But you can bet your ass that people are still going to call it that in the press, even though that's not at all what it is anymore. Whilst the new proposals will no longer require medical evidence, they will now be subject to evidence of living in their acquired gender for 6 months and will no longer include plans to extend legal recognition for non-binary people. Non-binary recognition will instead be looked into by a new working group. The most worrying quote appears near the end of the blog post. The Scottish Government will continue to promote and protect women's rights just as we will do so for trans rights. This is not and will not be at the expense of the rights of any other group. So Ashleigh, at the expense of either group's women versus trans people. What do you make of that?
So this was super disappointing, wasn't it? Because several times on the show, we've made mention, we have pointed north to Scotland to say, well, look, they're doing it really well. The Scottish Trans Alliance have, made this resource pack and this guidance, and it's been accepted here, and here, and there's some really good work going on there, and the government seem to be on board and are making all the right noises, and then suddenly that's just kind of stopped, and obviously there's this, which I saw a lot of people being, describing it as a rollback, and it's like that. Strictly speaking, that's not accurate because it kind of wasn't there to begin with. So they've scaled it down. So they have, in that sense, rolled back the scale of the plan because the initial noises that were being made were, this is going to go, it's going to go really well, isn't it? Given that initial 16-week consultation produced not overwhelmingly, but definitely positive results, unambiguously so, unlike some other votes that happened quite recently that we could mention. So again, it's kind of being set up as a women versus feminists, trans women versus feminism thing, which is just a false narrative, which is complete bullshit. But it is one that's peddled by Meghan Murphy, who of course recently spoke at the Scottish Parliament. There is clearly a recipient ear to trans-exclusionary ideologies within the SNP and within the Scottish Parliament. Clearly, something is happening there whereby it's like, well, we said we were going to do this, but whatever has happened behind the scenes, this conversation has happened between this person and that person, and this first person has expressed their valid concerns, which are in no way just bigotry dressed up as something new, and the other person has listened to those valid concerns in the pursuit of a kind of both sides consensus building thing, which... So there's that phrase, isn't there? And I can't remember where it's from, but it's a classic one that you hear in kind of socialist and Marxist studies all the time, which is that the rights of the minority should not be subject to the whims of the majority. But that is exactly what is happening by opening up a public consultation again after the first one was so toxic and divisive. They're essentially saying, oh, no, you guys are fair game, and we're going to let everybody else vote on whether they think you should be allowed legal recognition. Essentially is what they're saying. There's just the message that sends in and of itself is pretty gross. So yeah, this is super fucking disappointing.
It really is. You can pretty much point the blame for this on a small group of Scottish Party members of the Scottish Parliament, seem to be led by a woman called Joan McAlpine, who has dedicated a lot of her Twitter time to this, and is, it's safe to say that she's very much on the gender critical bandwagon. I don't think she ever put in a denial to that fact. She's been very upfront about it. And with this and the stuff going on at the Edinburgh Uni that we covered last time,
indeed,
there is a sizable amount of turf-based twattery going on in Scotland right now, and it's working for them. Because they've basically now got a seat at the table. Because the way that this has been phrased over and over again, it is that trans women and feminists disagree. And all of the statements that I've read about this have basically been trying to appease both of these camps. Right, we believe that trans women are women, we believe trans men are men, but we need to get the consensus across to people who rightly, and that's the phrase I keep using, rightly have concerns about these proposals. Doesn't matter that the concerns aren't really based on anything real.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to matter that the majority of the people who replied in the consultation are down with trans equality and the Gender Recognition Act reforms. Doesn't seem to matter. A small group are being given a bigger seat at the table, and I'm yet to see a decent justification as to why.
Indeed. Because these valid concerns that they so often point to are things like, well, it's about men in women's spaces, and then you press them on that, and it's like, well, that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about trans women in women's spaces. You're talking about excluding trans women. It's like, well, no, they're still men, and it's for the safety of women. It's like, okay, yeah, but why is that? Well, because a man could adopt a trans identity and then go into a bathroom and assault people. Okay, fine, but you do realize that entire line, that hook, that canard was completely made up by religious fundamentalists, and they admitted doing so at a conference and then published about it on a blog about how it was part of their strategy to try and other trans people, to try and use trans issues as a wedge issue within the LGBT community to, essentially try and limit everybody's rights. It's not because they specifically want to, although it is. I was about to say it's not specifically because they want to discriminate against trans people, but actually the evidence kind of goes against me on that one. It's more about, think about it, it's about bodily autonomy and reproductive rights and autonomy and choice and agency for anybody who isn't a white, straight man, essentially, because that is still being read as the standard, isn't it? That's kind of life on normal mode, and everything else is an aberration, and we shouldn't have to bother dealing with it, says everybody, because the people who are in charge of newsrooms and make the decisions about policies that get enacted are all from that demographic that I have just mentioned. So yeah, that was kind of rambly, I feel, but I just...
No, you're definitely onto something there. I think probably the most disappointing thing out of all this, because, at this point, there is still reform on the way. They have new plans for it. Basically, it's not going to be self-ID anymore, if it ever was. It's now going to be, right, you have to live enroll for 3 months, then you can apply for the GRC, then you have to do a 3-month sort of waiting period, I guess. So overall, You've got to live for 6 months in role now. And whilst that isn't particularly great on its own, there won't be any more medical evidence bullshit. That's still currently the plan. But the biggest disappointing thing is that non-binary recognition has been kicked out completely. It's not in consideration for this draft of the Act. And whatever a working group is, they're going to look into how to do it, where, it's not like people don't know how to do it. Countries around the world have started to do it. What do they need to look into here? It seems pretty straightforward to me. Admittedly, I'm a layperson. Maybe there's some deep statistical collection stuff that I don't know about, stuff with the census they need to get around. I don't fucking know. But it just seems so, that's just gone now. Even though, again, most of the people who replied to the first consultation were fully in support of the idea. And I don't necessarily see that changing in the next consultation. But we will keep you in the loop on when and that consultation happens, so we can go through the whole bullshit again of filling out that form. Yay! And hopefully the Scottish trans community will be able to keep their shit together through the next 16 weeks assessment, if and when that starts.
Well, the thing is, obviously, I think you and I are both acquainted with several members of the Scottish trans community, and honestly, they're a pretty resilient bunch, frankly, in both nationhood and transness. It's just like, well, no, please do not fuck with the Scottish trans people, because they will destroy you, frankly. So I pity the Scottish government, honestly, at this point. Anyway, moving on. What's next?
Next, some less terrible nonsense from the States. You may have seen some stories floating around that the Democrats have gone and blocked the transgender military ban from happening. And we're here to tell you that is not the case. On the 18th of June, the Democrat... No, I saw these reports and were just like, oh, yeah, brilliant, some good news. But no, it's not quite how people have presented it.
Yeah.
On the 18th of June, the Democrat-controlled House of Representatives added an amendment to a $1 trillion spending package that would block funding for the ban. That would mean that there would be no money to carry out any of the things involved in ejecting a trans person from the military or blocking trans people from enlisting. The amendment was brought forward by Democrat Representative Jackie Spare, who slammed the policy and the Trump administration by saying the president and his administration wrongfully argued that it's about military readiness and unit cohesion. But these arguments are the same ones that were made to keep the military racially segregated. Every service chief testified the transgender service would not disrupt unit cohesion and readiness. And he is right.
Mm-hmm.
He was probably the most right and correct person in the House of Representatives on the 18th of June that day.
Mm-hmm.
Whilst on paper, this looks like the ban isn't going to happen, the truth is that the spending package and its amendments will have to go through the Republican-controlled Senate, and so the amendment is likely to be removed at that point because Republican senators are garbage shit demons who care more about appealing to hateful garbage and selling everything in sight to the corporations that run the world at the expense of the people who actually make the world work. Wonderful!
Yes, indeed. I just watching you transform into a total communist. I'm so enjoying this.
I don't think that reaches into communist, though.
No, it doesn't.
That's just what is happening. That's what they're doing.
Yes, it is. But then as soon as we start saying conspiracy theories about, and you know who runs the corporations, right? That's when you can stop listening because, because it is just greed and capitalism and, kind of resurgences of regressive ideologies in insane and self-destructive lust for power, which has got us where we are. So I'm sure you'll agree. Nice and simple. Yeah, so it's kind of a stumbling block, isn't it? Everything Trump tries to do seems to hit a stumbling block and then it gets, signed off again and then off it goes. And it's like, and it's that confusion which is actually part of why it's so hard, because a lot of people who've lived under other repressive regimes. Yeah, I think I'm morally okay with saying that, suggesting that the US is repressive. Anyway, so...
without a doubt, there's no doubt. Just look at the border. Look at what ICE is doing. That is...
Yeah.
They are the Gestapo for now. That's what they are.
Literally concentration camps, yes. Fitting the actual textbook definition there, fact fans. Anyway, so yes, people who've lived in the other repressive regimes have kind of said that a certain amount of rule changing takes place, and the rules are this one day and that one, so you'd never know quite where you're at and how it specifically affects you. And I suspect with this state doing things differently from this state and that state doing something differently again, how that is going to be implemented in your state, there's going to be a tremendous set of anxieties about, the job for transgender service members and the other stuff that we've discussed about America in terms of healthcare and homeless shelters and all that sort of thing. All of this stuff comes together and, it can make a group of people very paranoid, very desperate, very sad, and, don't lose hope, American trans people. We love you.
No, there is still hope. I mean, this is a sign that there is a resistance. The Democrats, at least for now, appear to be mostly on the side of trans people. All of the Democratic candidates at this point have reaffirmed in some way their support for the trans community, mostly by saying that they would throw the military ban in the bin where it belongs to start with. And I think that seems to be where most of them are setting up camp when it comes to the trans issues because, veteran stuff, military stuff, huge deal in the States, so much huger than here in the UK, where you and I are quite cynical about the military, and many people are over here.
A little bit.
In America, that is not necessarily the case.
Well, I mean, I'm sure it is, but perhaps it's a little more private, and you and I don't see it in our Facebook webs.
No, but we don't, as a rule, say thank you for your service to people who have served in the army.
No,
that
really.
Just doesn't seem to happen here.
No, that's true. That's a cultural thing, really, isn't it? That they do that and we just kind of don't. So
yeah, we have our Help for Heroes stuff too, but I think that seems to be sort of a good way for Democrat candidates, to sort of wedge themselves into the issue, whilst also sort of using the pro-military kind of stance to sort of buoy their support in areas where it may not be quite as forthcoming, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
So, there's still hope on the Democrat side. So, if you're in America, keep voting for them Democrats, please. Please get rid of Trump, please. Because, as we're going to go into at some point next, our potential new prime minister is big friends with Trump and don't like that. Don't like any part of that.
Not fond, not keen, not keen at all. But before we get onto that little bit and get all political, because we weren't being political enough already, and all of this stuff rumbling on from different parts of the world, there is still, of course, for us, some reliable content out there from that same media outlet, those cheeky scamps at the Times.
Oh, the Times.
Oh, bless them. So far be it from us to comment on a particular story published by said outlet, but as a matter of journalistic duty, we feel it prudent to remind all of our listeners that the Times recently had an employment case brought against it by the former night editor of the Scottish edition of the paper, Catherine O'Donnell. So in brief, she worked for the paper for 14 years, transitioning while at work there. Her employment came to an end, and she has alleged wrongful dismissal with a hefty dollop of transphobia on the side. Now, as we've mentioned on the show before, this case and its outcome could have certain implications. Because part of O'Donnell's case is that the constant negative coverage of trans people in recent years has contributed to a hostile working environment. So should the decision be in O'Donnell's favour rather than that of the paper, aside from O'Donnell getting drinks bought for her by trans people presumably for the rest of her life, news outlets may also then have to consider the impact of negative coverage of a given issue on their own staff members. So the court has now heard all of the evidence and is now out, as they say, but is expected to reconvene at some point in July. So as you might imagine, we're all over this, and we're going to report in full once the decision is made and released. But strangely, there was very little reporting on this case overall. It was picked up by the LGBT press, and The Guardian published one story, but framed it quite badly and focused on the editor John Witherow's session giving evidence, without giving any kind of context as to why that might be considered important. Almost no one came up and reported on this one. So, again, in the interest of journalistic duty and fairness, we just thought we'd mention it.
So it's still a thing.
It is still a thing.
We're just waiting on them to come back, and then it's all about them coming up with a judgment.
Essentially, yes. So, but they're not even going to reconvene to start that until, well, at some point in July, and that's the best information that we could dig out.
Yeah, it's strange how this seems to have just suddenly died. Like,
I know,
there was
right?
Nobody talking about it.
Strange how it disappeared so quickly, isn't it? Very odd.
But we are going to keep going on about this, and we're going to go full and in-depth into it once all of it has wrapped up and we can look over what will happen as a result. I mean, it could totally end with a damn squib, like somebody gets paid off, nobody can talk about it ever again, it just vanishes forever. Or it could end with a massive win for O'Donnell, and then we will see the repercussions unfold in real time in front of our very eyes, which will be very, very interesting. Or she could lose.
Which would suck, yeah.
Whatever happens, it's going to be interesting, I think.
Well, yes. And
I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Hope's what we've got, so let's stick with that. Because we're going to need a whole bunch of that to even just get through reading the next story, which is not specifically a trans thing. It's actually slightly more wide-ranging than that, but you might have guessed it. The UK is about to get a new Prime Minister, our third in 3 years. How exciting is that? So Theresa May still running things at the moment as an interim Prime Minister, but as she is stepping down in the middle of her government tenure, the Conservative Party are now in charge of who gets to run the whole country. Yes, you heard that right. This is not an election in the classical sense, as only a few 100,000 registered members of the Conservative Party now get to choose who may well see us through the most ridiculous political upheaval this country has ever seen. And so, the two glorious, shining white knight candidates that the party has presented us with? Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson. So, I know. Yeah, it happens. It's like, I'm going to start calling whenever I physically expel some food or whatever. I'm just Johnsoning. I just need to go to the toilet. Don't even ask about hunting. So, first... So let's deal with him first. Jeremy Hunt. Who is he? What is he? Why is he? So one of the ways to get a full reading is, of course, to look at his past, which, being honest, is not great. He entered Parliament in 2005 as the newly elected Conservative MP for South West Surrey. And in 2010, he was named Culture Secretary by David Cameron, and since then has been attracting criticism from almost everyone. He was criticised for his handling of a merger between News Corp and B-Sky B, but then the Levinson inquiry cleared him. In 2012, he became Health Secretary and earned the hatred of almost every single doctor in the country over the next 6 or so years. Previously, he had co-authored Direct Democracy, a book which argued that the UK should adopt a healthcare model where people would pay into a personal health account and then use that to shop around public and private healthcare providers for the best care. And this was the fellow they put in charge of running the NHS. He also oversaw what amounted to a decrease in NHS funding under austerity, whilst demands on the NHS were skyrocketing for largely the same reason. He has also argued that the abortion limit should be lowered from 24 weeks to just 12, and then went on to demand that doctors should no longer be able to opt out of working weekends, arguing that the NHS should be a 7 days a week service. So this pissed off just about every single doctor in the country all over again, who argued that the NHS is already a 7-day service. He also earned the anger of junior doctors after totally bungling the employment contract negotiations, which resulted in many in the NHS going on strike multiple times during his tenure as Health Secretary.
Sounds like he was doing a fucking tremendous job.
Absolutely. Bang up job. Well done, Jezza. So what do you do to the man who starves the NHS of funding, causes strikes, and is generally a bit shit? Well, you promote him to Foreign Secretary, of course. So Hunt took the job in 2018, and since then has been totally cool with Saudi Arabia intervening in Yemen, and has defended, of course, the UK selling arms to Saudi Arabia. His stance on trans issues? Scary thing. No fucking idea. He was one of the few Conservatives who voted in favour of marriage equality, but to our knowledge, he hasn't specifically spoken on trans issues. What we do know is he is clearly an enemy of the NHS, and he did his best to trash it, so we cannot recommend voting for him if you happen to be a member of the Conservative Party who also listens to this podcast. Gotta admit, I think that Venn diagram is 2 circles. So, what about Boris Johnson? I don't know what that voice was in aid of. Would he be a better PM? No, he wouldn't. And the main problem, really, is that Boris Johnson is a racist. He has repeatedly been racist in print, calling burqa-wearing Muslim women letterboxes, has referred to Africans as having watermelon smiles, and has called them pickaninnies. He's had meetings with Steve Bannon, an actual fucking white supremacist, and he has repeatedly lied about many different things. He lied about the NHS getting £350 million a week after Brexit. He got fired from the Times as a journalist in 1988 for making up a quote, and in 2004 he was fired as Shadow Arts Minister for allegedly lying about an extramarital affair. Despite all of this, he was elected to being the Mayor of London, and during his time in this role, he promised to save London Underground ticket offices, which were mostly gone by the time he left office. He also promised to end the homelessness in London, which in the end, actually, homelessness increased while he was in office. He has built his entire career on appealing to the utter worst in people and is using his foppish charm to appear harmless. He is not harmless, as his role in foisting Brexit over all of us shows. There has been one occasion where he's mentioned trans issues at all, which was in his regular Telegraph column, where he argued that the police shouldn't waste their time arresting people for being transphobic and spend more time on knife crimes, which doesn't really tell us anything. That's precisely the same canard that such columnists would say when they just argue for more bobbies on the beat, bring back hanging. It's the same kind of appeal. And that's the problem. Johnson will go with whatever will make him look good. And if going against trans people makes him look good, then we had better strap in. Unfortunately, he's also the favourite for the job, even though just last week, the police were called to his flat that he shares with his girlfriend after neighbours reported screaming, fearing a domestic violence incident was taking place. Awesome. Great look. Wonderful. Final thing, Trump loves him, describing Johnson as an excellent choice. So, seriously, who was worse? The bumbling, vacuous, business-based nothing of a man called Jeremy Hunt, among other things, or the far-right courting, bumbling, moralless fuck that is Boris Johnson? Serious question. Who is worse?
Boris Johnson.
Yeah, I think so. But then, at the same time, Hunt the... Okay, no, I'm not going to give him his full nickname. But it's the health secretary stuff that's really quite galling and concerning and terrifying, because he is clearly a man who is in favour of a kind of privatised healthcare system that you pay into, right? Which completely goes against what the NHS is, and that's kind of bad, and so he will be quite happy to, as Prime Minister, strip mine the NHS and sell it to basically American healthcare interests. And the problem is Johnson looks like he'd be quite happy to do the same thing as well, it's just he would then nick the idea off Hunt and pretend it was his, because he's just that sort of chap. And the pair of them just seem like such spineless and slithery nothings of men who are just interested in their own naked ambition. Ugh, sickening. And it's like, why can't we stop this? Why can't we stop this terrible thing from happening? I mean, we can. Like, with a massive amount of collective action, we probably could, but it wouldn't be a good day, would it? And think of the travel disruption.
I think it would be a tremendous day. I'd be down for that. Everyone could stay around my place. We'll start some kind of
thing, and then
movement thing.
And we'll write revolutionary songs afterwards. It'll be hilarious.
Yes.
Seriously though, either of these two people is the worst possible choice. Right? And I know there's that whole Doctor Who thing about sometimes the only choices you can make are bad ones, but you still have to choose. And it's like, that was literally the worst Peter Capaldi impression I have ever done.
It's okay, we got there.
I didn't have time. I didn't have time to put the hours in, I'm afraid. But, but seriously, both of these guys are somehow both of them are the worst possible choice.
I don't know, there was some pretty bad choices in there. Michael Gove lost by like a couple of votes in the last round, so it could have been a Gove-Johnson battle. And Gove, I can't remember the name of his wife, but she writes for the Daily Mail and has been virulently transphobic. With Gove, there was a direct line to a transphobe in his life. I don't know how much that would have affected him when it came to trans issues in his job, you know, and obviously couples don't always agree on the same thing, but that was the closest link to direct transphobia that I could find, apart from with Dominic Raab.
Oh,
I think
him,
the guy who was all men's rights activisty and feminism's bullshit or whatever, like that guy thankfully is gone. So there were worse people than Hunt. There was nobody worse than Boris Johnson. So now we've got basically, who I would argue, Jeremy Hunt is one of the worst politicians I've ever seen. He has a major problem with publicly funded institutions. He sort of made it his mission to make the life of the BBC harder when he was a culture secretary. He did the same thing for the NHS. With him in charge, public services would definitely be in trouble, especially as the two candidates seem to be barreling towards who can out-Brexit the other. It just seems like both these candidates could lead the country to a particularly dark place. So, if you happen to be a member of the Conservative Party, do something. Jesus Christ, how can these two be the best of your fucking party?
Yes, well, that's not the message I would have given to members of the Conservative Party who may have listened. However, let's go with that one. Let's have that as our editorial standpoint. Do something, please.
Anyway, should we move on to the last bit of good news and get away from this?
Yeah, let's get away from all of this, like, forever. No,
for 2 weeks.
For 2 weeks, yeah.
Good plan. So, our final story. Janet Mock, broadcaster, writer, director, awesome trans woman of colour, advocate, legend, hero, all-around incredible person, has just landed an overall deal with Netflix where she will write, produce and direct potentially multiple TV shows and movies over the next 3 years. Woo! Janet has been a writer, producer and director on Pose, which is going through its second season in the States right now, so get watching that if you are able, and I will let you know when it's available in the UK. And she will now be a creative powerhouse for Netflix for the next 3 years. Details on specific projects are thin on the ground, but we will update you as and when news emerges. Yay! Woo! Janet Mock things! There's going to be so much more trans-created telly stuff going on, so yes.
And that's the good stuff, right? Like, because she knows, right? Janet Mock knows how to do trans content. She is a kind of writer and stuff, and is also trans, and her book Redefining Realness is fantastic, by the way. You should read it. Not just you, Michelle. I'm pointing my finger into my microphone like you're right there in front of me. Not just you, but Redefining Realness by Janet Mock is an incredible book. So yeah, check that shit out. And I can't wait to see what she produces working for Netflix. And aren't Netflix doing well lately? You know, they're a sort of cultural powerhouse of kind of queer and alternative and different and good and, you know, progressive content.
Yeah, what's that new show they're doing at the moment? We reported on it before, but I can't remember the name. Tales from the City? Is that what it is?
Yeah, they are. So it's a new version of the Armistead Maupin novel, which is apparently very good. I haven't watched it. I'm sorry. My excuse for literally everything over the last month and probably for the next few weeks is I'm sorry, MIF has completely swallowed my life. So, you are lucky. You're lucky I'm with you, Michelle. No, I'm sorry. Nobody is ever lucky to be with me.
I would argue that I'm very lucky to have you here. Because without you, I'd just be talking at my wall, and my wall isn't very good at conversation.
Neither's mine, to be honest. I've got to put this laptop in front of it and switch the microphone, and then there's these little voices. Anyway.
It's going to be fucking great. It's going to be so great. I was looking for someone to sort of take over, like, the Wachowski sisters spot as, like, sort of the trans artist in residence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Janet Mock is a pretty good person to step into that. Not saying the Wachowskis are done or anything. It's just, you know, they haven't got any plans to make anything anytime soon. They haven't made anything for a while except Sense8. You know, who knows what they're going to be doing. But Janet Mock right now is going to be working on media stuff about trans things written by trans people. Words are coming out of my mouth weirdly, so I'm going to stop talking like this.
I mean, you were kind of in Dalek mode. Words are coming out of my mouth. Yeah.
I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's happening to me today. Like, I probably cut them all out, but earlier on, you would not have heard me stumbling over my mouth so much.
Oh man, so much.
That was a lot of stumbling earlier. Anyway.
So for the next bit of the show, we thought we would take some time to reflect. Because we started this, the first episode of this podcast went out on the 11th of June last year. So we've now been doing this for just over a year, which is quite cool. And we sort of looked at the calendar and realized, oh, wow, we've been doing, check us out. Yeah, we've been established for an arbitrary amount of time. But we thought that this would be a good point to say, okay, well, here's some stuff that I was expecting and that I wasn't expecting, and that was the thing that we did that was really cool, and all that, so it's basically a recap show, but without the need of having to edit in bits of old episodes. So it's kind of like a recap show, but without being lazy.
I think we should probably sell it as Ashleigh and Michelle take stock and go over what they have learned.
Definitely. Well, firstly, the thing to do is you shouldn't ever take the stock. Like, it's very important to let it finish, because otherwise you just end up with it being all kind of greasy and it doesn't freeze very well. And then obviously when you try and defrost it, you get a really shitty gravy. So don't take the stock. You meant in the... Right, okay.
I'm a little bit offended that you don't think I know what to do with stock and gravy.
Okay, well, that's...
Don't you know me?
You're right, I do know you. I do apologise for insinuating.
This bitch knows how to do gravy, Ashleigh.
You are a northerner.
How dare you?
All right, okay. Fucking hell! We're fucking talking about me, I'll spark you out. Sorry, Manchester. So, I mean, but there has been so much stuff, though, right?
When you started this, did you see it going where it's been recently? Because things have, in the last 6 months, sort of kicked off for this podcast in ways I was not expecting.
Honestly, would we say even the last 6 months? Surely the last 3, really. Because obviously we have crowdfunded, woo! Which is why we didn't bother mentioning it at the beginning of the episode, because our crowdfunder succeeded, and thank you to everybody who donated and shared that, because our technological requirements are thoroughly taken care of. So
yeah, we have made it from random iOS apps to an entry-level sound recording setup.
Woo!
Those were not my words. Those are the words of a friend of mine who does sound stuff. They were very much like,
level.
Yeah, we've made it to entry-level podcasting.
Level. Yeah, love it. And it's only
that's not to speak down on the contributions people made or anything like that. It's just we had a budget of maybe like 60 quid that we spent on mics, and I spent 20 quid on an app to edit on my iPad with. And now we have computers.
We do.
So that jump is huge. But compared to, the top 10s on iTunes, we are very much still a DIY operation. And will probably be for the entirety of this podcast's existence.
Yeah.
But we sound a little bit sexier now thanks to these beautiful microphones.
We certainly do. Oh my.
Be careful, Ashleigh. I may come a flutter.
That's kind of the idea. I'm hoping to make at least a few members of the audience flutter. Just a little, It's been quite a thing, hasn't it? I think one of the first things we did, kind of the first big outings that we did, was Trans Pride Brighton, because we were there together, weren't we, last July?
Yeah, so much sweat, so much love. That came out wrong. So much warm weather and outside talking to people who became listeners.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I'm probably going to remember about that particular Trans Pride Brighton, yes, definitely the sweating. So much sweating. Brighton's surprisingly hilly, which I wasn't aware of. It's like, it's a coastal town. It's supposed to be flat. It was wonderful, wasn't it? We spoke to so many people, and kind of people who were mutually acquainted. And I was like, oh, so you know Michelle as well, do you? Because obviously the trans community is fairly small. And we were more or less all there in that park in Brighton on and I got a tremendous sunburn on that exact day, right, where we went out and did the parade and stuff. I was foolishly wearing a backless dress and didn't even think to put sun lotion on it because I'm just such a... Anyway, so I had a nice, almost W-shaped burn in my back for the next couple of months. And that was like, oh yeah, I had such a good time, but oh my God, it hurts me to wear literally any item of clothing. So yeah, that's one thing I'll remember from that Trans Pride Brighton is wear sunscreen.
Yeah, but you're not doing Pride season right if you don't get a little bit of sunburn.
I know, right? You've got to have... And there was a point in Brighton when I was walking along... I'd just been swimming in the sea. I'd met my friends. We'd been on the beach. We'd been swimming in the sea. And then I was walking back along Brighton Promenade and I got an ice cream from a van. And I was like, oh, yes, this is how I do holidays. I am okay with this. So.
But we were sweet summer children because we did not see coming all of the shit that was going to happen with that bloody consultation afterwards, right?
Well, I think we kind of did because if you remember, like the second or third episode we ever did was me saying, I got invited to Downing Street.
Yeah, I was expecting the invites to Downing Street to come after our 8th or 9th episode.
That's fair, yeah. I'm not sure I'm totally...
But in the end, it was just you.
Yes.
Just saying, I was sat outside, like some kind of pleb, waiting for my friend to come out from the party so we could go get a drink.
Yes. Well, we didn't have a drink. We had we did have a drink, and then we had a burger. That was awesome. Although I was definitely in the mood for gammon after spending the afternoon in the Downing Street garden. I'm not looking for another invite in the post this year or anywhere. The last one came through email. I'm like, I'm not doing that. I'm almost certainly going to be busy at MIF. Sorry, I can't go and see your Prime Minister. I've got art to do.
Yeah, but which Prime Minister?
Well, fuck. Just don't even... Actually, maybe I should go and take a milkshake.
There'll be the new PM will be announced on the 22nd of July. It's that fast. Probably should have mentioned that in the main bit. Whoops, sorry. We're mentioning it now, so it's fine.
So yeah, that was a thing. Downing Street, right? Maybe we'll get invited as a unit at some point, and we can just refuse or something. But then in that,
I would love that just to be in the position to refuse.
Yeah, I know.
Like that would be the best thing that had ever happened to me. Just to be like, no,
fuck off.
No, I'm not having a drink with you.
So that was a thing that happened that we reported on the podcast. But then the self-same episode also contained stuff that you went and did, because obviously Pride season's always good, and we started up the podcast kind of at the start of a Pride season. So there was Nintendo Pride. We talked about London Pride, which is where all the shit started to go down. But the reason I got invited to Downing Street in the first place is because that was the date of the launch of the consultation, the 3rd of July last year. So I thought, okay, so people are going to try and use this and there's going to be discourse over the next few months. However, you're quite right. I was not prepared for how toxic a lot of that discourse was going to be.
It was so bad. Like, there were parts of me that were thinking, this is the worst time to start a podcast, because it just seems like this little thing we do every 2 weeks, we just talk over the news and have a laugh. Suddenly, the laughs weren't coming, because every week it was just like, oh, here's some horrible people saying nightmarish shit on the BBC. Oh, look, here's some other people saying some awful stuff. Oh, look, there's this whole group of people now who campaigning for policies that would wind up with a hell of a lot of dead trans people. Like, oh, this is a wonderful time to be alive, isn't it?
Yeah, I know, right? And so it's like, you kind of think, why are we doing this? Because you and I were just plowing through so much awful, terrible news, which may have inspired the name of the segment. Read into that what you will. And it just became such a slog, didn't it? Because that consultation was open from the July to the October. It ended up getting extended by another few days. And we were like, oh God, more of this. I just want it to stop.
Just let it die.
Enough.
Let it fucking die.
But it brings it back to the same point I made earlier on about how, stop having public consultations on things which don't need them. Because it was just grossly stressful. The press hostility reached a fever pitch, which I would argue it hasn't really descended from. It's kind of kept that level of vitriol and just carried on trucking even though the consultation is now over. And who knows what effect that is happening on the people who are analysing the data from the consultation. And they're like, oh, well, we can't be too trans-inclusive because that risks pissing off a load of people who are funded by the fucking American far right, because, that's precisely the sort of thing that we should be doing. Anyway.
So when it comes to you, like, I think what would be interesting is, what's the hardest part of making this podcast been for you? What is the part that you have struggled with over the last 12 months of doing this ridiculous enterprise?
Well, I'm pretty sure you can guess. It's the self-care element, really, and the trying to look after my mental health. Because I'm not just, we're not just doing the podcast. We have other stuff we do in our lives, right? Like jobs and people we talk to and things we go and do and whatever. And all of that stuff still goes on, right? And then obviously I'm worried by and scared by all of the terrible coverage. And then I'm kind of diving deep into it for the podcast, although I'm still seeing it anyway. So that's not making too much of a difference, but it's just like plowing through this stuff or just seeing it regurgitated day after day, again and again, the same bloody nonsense points being repeated by the same people, it gets a little bit frustrating. So that was, I found that really difficult to deal with, actually, and I was kind of braced for it. I don't think I was braced for it sufficiently, and that is why I took a break over Christmas.
See, with me, it was the opposite kind of thing. Doing this podcast made it easier for me to look at all of the shit, because whilst I was researching stories, and at first it was very much like, oh, this is the worst thing ever. Oh no, this is the worst thing ever. Oh no, this is the worst thing ever. We're all doomed, trans people. It's done. We're all fucked. But then eventually, at some point, that changed, and I started to look for ways. I started to look for more fuller picture of what's been happening. Yes. And I always seem to find little caveats that basically made the news not necessarily as bad, or things we can do about it.
Which is really, that's the important thing. And I remember, because you and I had a conversation at the start of this year, and I think we sort of said, okay, there are things that people can do, that we can do, and that other people can do, and I think we should actually talk about those things, right? We should try and say, okay, look, there's some bad news, but there are things that we can do about it. There are people working on it. There's this, which means it might not be. The entire history of the LGBT movement and other civil rights movements have been when a group of people that are affected by the same issues get together, talk, and come up with a plan of what they can do. And actually anybody can do that. You don't have to be part of a charity. You don't have to be running a podcast. You can just be okay, here are some actions that we can take either directly or indirectly, writing to your MP, organising a protest, or forming a new talking circle about a particular thing for a particular community, whatever. All of that stuff adds up, and it all matters.
I think we've had some success there when it comes to spreading information, because we have had feedback from people saying that they learned stuff that they wouldn't have ever have got from anywhere else. I think that means that what we've been doing has been kind of working.
I mean, you kind of, the traditional thing that you say is, oh, well, I would like to think so, but I genuinely would, actually, if it's kind of bringing help or kind of facts or just a sense of positivity to people, then great. I think we're doing the right thing. You know.
I mean, there was one of my favourite moments from the last 12 months was when Andrew Gilligan published a piece of shit in the Times, as he is wont to do.
Yeah, I was going to say, could you be a little more specific?
Well, I will be specific. He basically published a piece saying that there is a prison in South London that will operate as Europe's first transgender inmate wing.
Yeah.
And he implied that it could become policy that all trans prisoners in the UK are moved there. And we debunked that by calling up the Ministry of Justice twice and got the answer. And that was a real turning point for me, because it was just like, okay, this podcast isn't just about spreading news per se, or by sort of recounting what we believe are important things that the trans community should be talking about. That could be described as a piece of activism right there, combating bad information published by one of the UK's most prominent assholes. And it was not that hard to do. We sort of kept up with that. Occasionally I'll do these little tweet threads where something will have come up in the press. I'll think that doesn't sound right. I make a phone call, find out it isn't, and then I just publish a bunch of stuff on Twitter. And those were always the most popular tweets we do, and so that was a real turning point.
Yeah, and it's amazing how easy it is, isn't it? Like, you know, we literally there was this whole story in the Times based on a couple of points, which we phoned up, you phoned up Ministry of Justice and this department and that, whatever. And, a couple of phone calls sorted, and actually it's quite easy to check that. And to the extent that we wondered, why is no one else doing this?
Yeah, and then there was all that stuff with the Ballantine Health Clubs group and the David Lloyd Gyms group, who were said to make it policy that trans people would have to use the wrong changing areas and stuff like that. And we called them up, and they just didn't know what was going on, and it just turned out to be really grey, and there's since been no reports on it. And we pretty much got to the bottom of that after a couple of phone calls as well. That's definitely the biggest thing I learned over the year of doing this, is that the stuff that you hear in the press may not always be true, and it is so easy to find out. And I would encourage everyone who's listening to this, if you read something in the press and you're just thinking, that can't be right, do a Google and make a phone call. Because chances are, it's probably bullshit, and it's probably already out there that it's bullshit, but the press have already taken it and ran with it. You know what I mean? We've seen that loads of times with Ian Huntley, where people were saying that he was trans, he was going to come out and transition, it was going to be a whole thing. Turned out to be nothing but a transphobic fucking lie from The Sun and a whole other bunch of places. But that probably could have been easily debunked as well if somebody made a phone call. We didn't, because it happened pretty much just before we started to do it ourselves.
No, because the whole myth of Huntley being a trans person first surfaced in, 2016? So that's over a year before we started Well, 2 years.
Yeah, 2 years before we even started doing this fucking thing.
Exactly. So that's the annoying thing, which kind of leads me on to something else that I kind of wanted to point out. Is something that I've noticed is, I guess, cycles. And we're kind of seeing the same kinds of story popping up a lot. And it's, in a sense, it's kind of at the behest of somebody else's agenda, right? When the community feels beleaguered, embattled or whatever else, when it's very difficult to get anything done, because if you're constantly firefighting, and this is a thing that's noticed in business and activists and various other circles, if you're constantly having to deal with this lie and that misinformation and this bullshit story, then you don't actually have time to sit down and get on with whatever strategic goals you had in mind, be you mermaids or gendered intelligence or whoever. If you've got to spend your time picking out all of the chunks of corn from the big piles of shit, by the time you have done that and said, well, listen, this story was published 2 weeks ago and it was wrong in this way, and bang, 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 by which point the news cycle's moved on and no one's going to pay it the blindest bit of notice. And so we found ourselves talking about the same few things, circling around the same few drains for quite a lot of our episodes. And a lot of it is based on the same few canards and tropes and bits of misinformation, like the bathroom predator myth, that are just coming up again and again, in spite of the fact that it is kind of widely known, certainly within the LGBT community, that, you know, those things, you know, well, that's a lie and that was made up by this religious group and blah, blah, blah. You know, those things are relatively common currency. But in the wider world, that is not the case. And people just kind of don't know, oh, well, I hadn't really thought about it, you know. And while that's a bit frustrating, you can't look at that and think, you know, are they doing that deliberately? Because we do have to spend a bunch of time firefighting, and there is an agenda working against the trans community. You know, it's trans exclusionary radical feminists, or call them whatever the hell you want. Those people and their allies are working against us. That is what they spend their time doing. They are actively trying to deny us rights and to hold back progress. And when you're kind of up against that, you know, people who are really, really committed to this lie and will just try and bareface their way out of everything, you know, you kind of hope that all of the facts would speak for themselves. What you want to happen is you release the truth and make sure the truth is out and let everybody make their own decision, and then hopefully everybody will make the right decisions, but that's just not what happens. It's because it's the kind of spin on the thing that comes out is so important, so you talked about something a little bit earlier on in the show where, like, the kind of lie or simplified version of the story of the American stuff we talked about a little bit earlier on, where the reportage of, you know, Democrats block Trump's military ban thing, that makes it around the world, but the actual truth of it is a little bit more complicated and not as many places reported on that in full.
I think that in some respects you're giving some people in that quarter too much credit, because there's one thing that I have read a lot of stuff by Andrew Gilligan now. I think I've pretty much read everything he has published over the last 2 years now at various... I've looked this stuff up at various points, researching other stories about him and other things like that. And whilst that is true, there is definitely a group of people who are ideologically against the idea of trans people being a thing. And those people are out there, and we can probably learn a thing or two from them about organising, because they are very good at it. I'm convinced that there is a certain part of the journalist crew where it's not necessarily an ideological fight, but they have no qualms in painting a villain and creating an audience against that villain because it is interesting, because it gets clicks. And that is, I'm pretty sure, where Gilligan lands, because that is,
I believe
people like him land, because that's what they do. So I don't think necessarily that the press have like an alliance with the anti-trans sentiments like that, but they will definitely use it to make some cash.
Basically, yes. And you're quite right. I'm not suggesting that all of this anti-trans stuff is part of some overarching conspiracy which is being minutely controlled, but it is a group of people using a very coherent media strategy to get their message out there and having that message picked up because it is inflammatory. It's kind of things, you know, feeding into each other and feeding off each other and creating a perfect storm of lies, misinformation and bullying. Isn't that a delight?
But do you know what I also learned amongst all of this poop and sweet cornless poop everywhere?
Mm-hmm.
If you say you are a journalist, you could get into almost anywhere.
Ooh, yes, I've learned that one as well.
I don't know when it started, but about 6 months ago, I saw I know when it started, actually. The BFI were doing the Flair LGBTQ plus film festival.
I remember.
And I was like, I would quite like to go to that, but I don't think I have the money to do all of that stuff. But it would be really cool to report on things from there and, talk to some filmmakers. Then I saw a link at the bottom of the page saying media accreditation. And I was like, I am part of a media outlet. And if I say that, it becomes true. So I applied and they just totally sorted me out. And all of the PR people there, they set me up in the corner of this big old media center. Talked to everybody I wanted to talk to, just covered the whole event. It was incredible. We did a whole episode on it.
We did.
If you haven't listened to it, scroll back. It's one of my favorite ones that I ever put work to. It was so fucking cool, the whole thing. And I was in disbelief. It was just like, oh, I get access to all of this stuff, and all I have to do is report on it.
Cool.
And people get paid for this. What? We didn't get paid any money for it at all. I should probably mention at the top, but, I was there pretty long days just talking to film directors. It was fucking incredible. And the response from that episode was really, really big as well, because people, like on the Twitter and stuff, were getting back to us, because we started actually hearing back from people about them. Then as well.
That
like
was
before,
nice.
It was mostly radio silence, and all of a sudden, we suddenly started to get people tweeting us saying, yeah, I really like the episode. Oh, I can't wait to see Corlaganda or any of the other things that you recommended and stuff. And it was like, oh, cool.
Yeah, people listen.
Every level of that was fucking incredible. And I think that's when things started to ramp up for me, when I was just starting to be like, oh, we've got something here.
We can potentially do a thing here. Yes, indeed. And I remember you being, really effusive and enthusiastic. You'd been at BFI, and I'd been sort of, talking to you throughout the day because I've been at work, I guess. And then you were like, I really think we've got something here. And I'm like, okay, that's great, darling. I'll talk to you in the morning. Calm down. Kind of thing, but lo and behold, you were right. So,
I did not see that coming. When we started this thing, it was just going to be a thing we did in our bedrooms, and all of a sudden, I started to accumulate press passes.
Yes.
And this year I've gone for accreditation at Sparkle, London Pride, and Brighton Trans Pride. So we're going to be continuing with that more on the scene reporting. Now Indeed. We've got some better microphones and stuff. We can actually make it not sound like total arse. Which admittedly was a huge problem for the first 6 months of the podcast existing, just because the equipment wasn't there and we didn't know how to use it.
We did not.
Even if we did start off with all of this stuff, we wouldn't have sounded very good. It was good that we put in we learned at the front lines of the war. And now we have better equipment to continue that same war.
And do we have to call it a war? She says,
no.
Referring to everything in terms of strategy and tactics. Anyway, but I mean, it kind of feels like one though, doesn't it? Every day there's a new sort of psyops attack or something.
Yeah, there's always another thing that needs to just be looked into.
Oh, well, let's just check this one out. Oh, I wonder what that could mean for this, and I wonder what the knock-on effects of that would be for this, and you end up just becoming a total news junkie, but a very specifically trans news junkie, and so you kind of know all of the stuff that's going on, but also have forgotten to eat for 2 or 3 days. So, and that's...
I wish that was a problem with me. So, yeah, where did the podcast get you into?
It's mostly just been, rather than getting into somewhere, it's gaining me what I heard referred to actually at a meeting quite recently as my cultural capital. Because, as I have mentioned, I, as well as working for MIF, and doing this and being in a band, and I just need to stop, don't I? But anyway, in addition, the main thing really that I care about, that I put a lot of work into, whether that's paid or not, is obviously the trans liberation struggle. And there are a lot of fronts in that particular peninsular war. So there are a couple of projects being worked up, a couple of which I am at this point not at liberty to reveal the details of, but meetings happen. Essentially, and always at meetings there are new people that you meet, and it's like, oh, okay, so which organization are you from, and blah blah blah, and it's like, oh, so who are you? Oh, well, I'm Ashleigh Talbot, and I volunteer with this organization, and I do a podcast. Oh, which podcast is that? Oh, it's called What the Trans. Oh, that's that's you, kind of thing. Or most recently, I was in a room full of academics and one of them said, oh, wow, that one's on my list. Great. That's been recommended to me. And I'm like, who has recommended it to you? That's wonderful. Kind of thing. So hello, if you're listening, by the way. Happy for you to have joined us.
I've been getting a different end of things. Whilst there has been occasionally sometimes when people say, oh, that's where I know your voice from. That's been few and far between. Like, most people I interact with have no idea what the podcast is, but my name is on the list being allowed to go in, so they just assume it's a thing.
Got you.
Which is pretty fucking awesome. But I'm not entirely sure about... Like, it sounds like you have attained a level of celebrity in your local area, which I have not, and I'm kind of comfortable with that. I don't know what I would do if people recognize me like that.
I think there's... For me, I think there's a couple of things at play, because... There was the stuff I did before I started this podcast, which helped, right? Because I've done a certain amount of media work before with the BBC and with Manchester's local television channel while that was still a thing. And so I actually presented a television show on that channel. So I was on the telly, and I would occasionally get recognised by people on the telly, mostly people in the village, because I was presenting an LGBT news and discussion type show. Very similar to what we're doing now, but with a little bit more of the rainbow.
Yeah, you were already a broadcaster.
I was already doing the thing, and that's how we met, if you remember, because there was the podcast that I used to do quite regularly with a comrade up here, and he was a mutual friend to both of us, and indeed introduced us electronically, and doing this television-y type stuff. I wasn't getting paid for that. It was a few hours a week sort of thing, but I wasn't getting paid, but I was still doing the volunteering-y type stuff, most predominantly for the LGBT Foundation, and at that time, probably Action for Trans Health, which I'm no longer involved with for a number of reasons. And then I kind of wasn't doing anything for a bit because the television show stopped and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I'm okay with this. This is fine. And then suddenly Michelle says, Ashleigh, let's do a podcast. I'm like, oh, brilliant. Yes. You know, I was like, that's not having a rest, Ashleigh.
I remember selling it to you just like, it won't be that much work. It'll be a few hours every 2 weeks.
Yeah, well, it worked, right? So
I mean, I didn't know it was a lie, but it turned out to become a lie.
Well, that's all right. Because I think one of the things that people have pointed out on the Twitter, and when you and I have been at events and we've met somebody who's listened to the podcast, is you and I do have a certain rapport, or so we are told. And I think that's something nice. I think we've kind of found that groove with each other, and we are the two trans friends you didn't know you needed. So happy to fulfill that role for our listeners. And if we could give all of you a hug, we would. But honestly, my arms they're good, but they're not that long. I'm really sorry.
So where do you think we could do better? Because I did put a tweet out asking people to suggest ways we could do better, and the silence was conspicuous.
Well, I mean...
I was hoping to get a few people coming in and just saying like, oh, well, you've not really covered this as much as we think you should, or you covered this badly, or you used outdated terminology here, and that just didn't happen, which I'm not going to read as us being absolutely fucking perfect.
Well...
I'm going to just put that down to our listeners being so kind and so nice and not wanting to hurt our feelings, but if I was asking you to be objective, Ashleigh, where could we do better?
I think we've been doing a couple of the things that could be being done better. I think we've been doing them better recently, but we still kind of need to do it more. I think the key, it's a question of who we talk to, and in that sense, perhaps who is on the team, really, because... As in who is involved, and because there are several people who we occasionally talk to and contribute. Obviously, we speak to Perry reasonably frequently in North Carolina, but it's all very white, isn't it? And you and I both talking from the perspective of trans women. I think there's additional consideration that could be given to other perspectives that we might want to think about how we work that in. I think there's probably a certain amount of merit in essentially discussing other axes of oppression, in terms of like race and disability and so on. I think at some point we should maybe do a bit of a kind of, well, look, what is the feminism? And first wave, second wave, all of that stuff, inclusiveness, blah, 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 because I am conscious of the fact that I do kind of use a certain amount of terminology from that and come out with some of the concepts, but I actually think that that's genuinely some interesting stuff from a slightly more academic sense, but I don't know if our listeners would find that interesting or if that's just me saying, oh, well, and it could be like this and we can make this comparison and blah, 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 because academic text is actually quite difficult to give a bit of zazz. So I think we should just be aware of who we are, essentially, and be aware that when we're talking, you and I do have certain privileges that other members of the trans community don't, and we should try and make the things that we do talk about as kind of accessible as possible, and not assuming, okay, we're going to talk about this story and we're going to just launch straight into a very complicated thing without giving you any prior context. I think we have done an acceptable job of that on most episodes. Yeah, but and also we definitely need to listen, right? And if somebody says, okay, look, you guys have really kind of cocked this one up, we have to listen to it and fine if the tone of the argument is a bit like, oh, okay, well, calm down. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you, but don't be offended by that. And actually, this is just generally good advice for people who have been called out on something. Don't make it about you. Again, I've just completely rambled there, didn't I? Ashleigh's theory.
No, you pretty much hit many nails on their heads. Like, we are pretty goddamn white.
And English.
We need to boost a whole bunch of people that don't look entirely like us.
Pretty much, yeah.
Which at certain points has been a slight challenge. Like, for example, on the music episode we did, I wanted to get a smorgasbord and represent pretty much every conceivable end of the transgender musician spectrum. Problem with that is that by dint of I don't even know what, we had like 20 white trans women send us tracks.
Which is super cool.
But then we wanted people from other sides of things and like all over the spectrums, all over all of the spectrums, and we just didn't get.
But then perhaps that's something for you and I to think about, because maybe our listenership is mostly composed of that demographic for a reason.
Oh, exactly. That was the point I was going to drive to, is that maybe we haven't done as best as we could in appealing to trans people of colour, which is definitely something we are going to have to look at and have lots of very, 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 very in-depth conversations about, I think. So if anybody has any ideas or anybody wants to get involved and help us out on this front, give us a tweet at What the Trans, send us a DM. Our DMs are open to the world. Send us a message. Let's do this.
Let's signal boost, right? Because we get to do that now. We have a platform. We have like however many, is it hundreds or have we gone to thousands of listeners by this point?
We have just crossed 1,000 regular downloads across all the things.
Oh, good Lord. That is like easily 997 more than I thought we'd ever have. So,
that number has kept me up at night. Just like, oh, that's nothing in the grand scheme of the internet, but for what we're doing, like, that's a lot of people out there who know who we are now. That's peculiar.
They know the sounds of our voices.
Yeah,
absolutely. But I think we've been doing as well as you might expect from two such idiots as us, but we could always be doing better. And I think part of that is kind of signal boosting stuff. I think you and I might want to consider, as well as talking about news and depressing type stuff, a couple of people have said, well, it's you guys sat down having a conversation, or occasionally with sort of 2 or 3 other people and chopped in interviews and stuff. But I think people were just, I know 1 or 2 people have mentioned kind of the dynamic, because it is just you and I talking for, an hour and a half. So there might be other ways that we could do that. There might be other ways of showcasing what's going on in the trans community. There might be an idea to do a kind of regular slot of some kind for art or music or whatever. I think we've toyed with the idea before. Again, I don't know how well received that would be. But we do have so many options, and we're kind of lucky to have, well, we're definitely lucky to have our audience, because they just bought our technology. Once again, thanks guys, and gals, and non-binary pals. But also, I suspect we've got a reasonably loyal listenership, and that's super good too. And I think we trust you. And so if you have suggestions or things that you think we should do, or stuff that you think we should be covering, or people that you think we should be signal boosting, hell, tell us. We will do it. So...
Unless it's rubbish. Unless your idea is just awful, like how we should record the podcast wearing Santa hats. That's just a silly idea.
And wearing beards made of tinsel that constantly rub against the microphones in a slightly annoying rustling sense. I mean, if we were going to do an avant-garde episode, then maybe, but that's, as an edge case, let's not plan too hard for it.
All right, well, I think it would be good to wrap up this with what kind of things we have planned for the future. Because year 1 is done.
Yeah.
In year 2, I mean, we've talked sort of loosely about this on the off hours, but I think it's safe to say now that we are ramping up into beginning video content.
Yes, I think we're allowed to announce that. So, along with that, there's a couple of additional personnel who are kind of helping us drive towards that. And we're always interested in talking to people, and it's probably worth pointing out as well. In terms of the video content, and indeed for the ongoing podcast content, we would quite like that to be as global as possible. So if you're a listener from America, from some part of the world that isn't necessarily Northern Europe, or indeed basically somewhere that isn't the UK, we would love to hear from you. Come and be one of our correspondents. But this essentially means that in year 2, we are probably expanding. As an organisation, we're not an organisation, it's just the two of us, as in we're expanding what we do, we're expanding how we do it, and we're expanding the people that we do it with. And hopefully, we're expanding the minds of our audience.
Like LSD, only not quite as exciting.
Yeah, nowhere near as exciting. But
we're cheaper.
Considerably, yes, absolutely.
We are considerably cheaper than drugs.
Yes. I'm not quite sure how we ended up here. What the trans? Cheaper than drugs. That's the editorial standpoint of what the trans is, that we're cheaper than drugs.
That's how we should open all of our shows.
Definitely. Hello, it's official. We're cheaper than drugs. My name is Michelle, and I'm Ashleigh. And I am also here. Yes, well, thank you for doing this with me, and thank you for kind of kicking me into doing it as well, because this is not something I would have started on my own. Whereas you saying, oh, I'll do most of the work, and you just get to kind of, pick some news stories and whinge about things, definitely sold me on it. Obviously, it's developed into more than that, but whenever you start a new thing, particularly a media project, it's like, well, this is going to escalate, and you just kind of accept that. Really, and you just sort of roll with it and say, well, I say to myself that this is a few hours a week, but realistically it's quite a lot more, and a load of emotional labour and stress and whatever else. But we're still doing it because, now we're getting on to why, and that's a much more difficult question. So let's wrap it up.
Well, before the wrap up, I'd just like to say that I'm very glad that you came along and we both decided to do this thing, because I've not made it any kind of secret that the last few years for me have been pretty chaotic with the old mental health. Mm-hmm. I've been through some stuff. I'm sure many people can empathise with that, and doing this podcast has helped to the point where I'm now in my own personal life, as a result of the podcast, I've got 2 very exciting opportunities potentially coming up in the very near future, which I will be announcing on here as and when they become finalised, because they will be of great interest to our listeners, I'm sure. But this podcast has led me for the first time towards paid work.
Indeed.
Getting actual work, which will be the first time in over a year since I've had any kind of part-time job. And maybe down the line they would result into me going full-time doing one of these 2 things. But I will let you know what specifically they are when I'm allowed to. But yeah, doing this podcast definitely helped me in ways that I didn't see coming when we started. So thanks for coming along this ridiculous endeavour, Ashleigh. Couldn't have done it without you. It has been fun.
It's been quite a thing, hasn't it? And yes,
it really has.
I've learned a bunch of stuff as well. I mean, I wouldn't... In some cases, the stories that you see again and again, like times transphobia and fucking stickers and whatever, the stuff that crops up again and again, we didn't learn that. We just kind of more got it pummeled into us by the year, insisting, are you paying attention to this? Are you paying attention to this? Yes, thank you, Mr. News Cycle. Will you please stop hitting me now? But in addition to that, there's been so much stuff that has surprised me, and so much stuff where there's some terrible news story, but out of that, there's been rebellion from, a particular Republican, and it's like, oh, I wasn't expecting that, or an election or a court decision goes a different way, and it's like, oh, I was not expecting that, and it does actually seem to indicate that things can get better, and they are probably in the process of doing so, but we have to make sure that carries on. And unfortunately, it means the trans community and the LGBT community and various other minority communities can't take things that we have now for granted. They could be taken away just as easily. But we are all in this together, podcast listeners. And you and I, Michelle, will carry on doing the thing and trying to tell you what's going on and trying not to completely depress you while we're doing that. So
yeah, the number one I know I keep saying the number one thing I've learned, but this one is another big one that just how fucking incredible is the trans community in the UK.
Yeah,
and I'm sure it is just as good in the US, but we don't have as much contact with that for obvious reasons. But the trans community in the UK, so diverse, so many different people doing so many incredible things. There's so many people like running little like meetup groups and stuff in the middle of, I don't know, Slough, right the way up to the most northern parts of Scotland, where there's like this little community centre which runs a trans night once a month or something, right the way down to London when you got people on the front lines of Westminster just trying to get our interests heard about by all the MPs wandering around. There is every single trans person in this country is fucking incredible. That is something that I've found myself thinking about time and time again when looking stuff up.
With the possible exception of Debbie Hayton.
Oh yeah, she's the worst.
Yeah.
She's the one bad trans person.
There's more than the one, but let us not speak their name.
She's one of a very tiny group of less than 20 trans people that suck.
Yes, let us not speak their names for fear of giving them power. But yeah, we're not all perfect, but yeah. Just want to echo what you said. The trans community were so creative and vivacious and energetic and different, and that word again that I mentioned for Scotland before, resilient. We're a tough bunch, and we're not going anywhere. And the people arguing against us, the trans exclusionary people, are on the wrong side of history, and the castle that they're arguing from is built on sand and lies. It's not going to work. So we just have to see if we can stop the entire world from ending because of a climate crisis, and then we'll see what else we can do in terms of a utopia. But that's a story for another time. So,
yeah.
Thank you to you, Michelle, and thank you to the listener for coming along with us on this magnificent trans journey.
Yeah, it's been good fun. And do you like the work that we've done? If so, why not consider leaving a review or a rating for us on iTunes, Google, or wherever the hell you listen to this ridiculous thing? That will basically show that, you know, some people out there like what we do, and maybe more people will discover the podcast due to your kind or not so kind words. And also, you can check out all of our social media stuff. Twitter.com/whatthetrans, Facebook.com/whatthetrans, whatthetranspod.tumblr.com. Send us a message. Tell us what we're doing right. Tell us what we're doing wrong. Tell us about a thing that you don't think is getting enough attention, and we will look into it.
And there is still the option for you to send us a song, because our final act for each episode that we do now is playing a song sent to us by a member of the trans community. So this is new music. You may remember we did our musical special a few episodes ago, so this is one of the bands who featured on that compilation with a different song. This is Polythene Pam. The song's called Ballad of a Gen X. I've listened to it. This song is incredibly relatable. You can buy the album from Polythene Pam band.bandcamp.com. It's on $7 and pay what you want, or polythenepamband.com is the main website. So yeah, take it away and good night.
Goodbye.
Oh, I can't leave my house. I can't leave my house. I'm just sitting here getting fat and thrown on the couch. Everything I ever need is brought here by delivery, and I may never see the sun again. The younger generation, they got some great inventions intended to disrupt my point of view. And I might get old before I die, but I will always wonder why my avocado toast is turning blue. Ew. I can't leave my house. I can't leave my house. I'm just sitting here getting high and strumming on the couch. Everything I ever need is brought here by delivery, and I may never see the sun again. Well, they tell me not to be concerned and that I still have much to learn, a point that I would surely not dispute. But while I might not be a sage, I've learned a thing or two at age. A fact their algorithms can't compute. I can't leave my house. I can't leave my house. I'm just sitting here getting fat and strumming on the couch. Everything I ever need is brought here by delivery, and I may never see the sun again. They tell me it has no effect, and yet they manage to elect a man who wears a hamster for a hat. And when I leave the starting gate, I'll